Welcome, everyone, and good morning. And I think we're going to get started now. I just wanted to say I'm Terry Fleming, Director of Research Ethics BC, and I want to welcome you to this event. The event is being recorded and will be made available on the Research Ethics BC website at a future date. And at this time, I wish to start by acknowledging with gratitude and humility that I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And today we are fortunate to also be joined by Elders Grouse and Pamela Barnes, who have kindly agreed to open our event. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela and Grouse. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Barnes. My ancestral name is Chuchuwasket, which means the coming of a storm or the coming of change. And it's my honor today to do the welcoming, and Grouse will follow with acknowledgement of the day. So in doing the welcoming, I want to, first acknowledge that we're in this time of Zoom. So we're all coming in from different places, different locations. And so it's important that everyone acknowledge the lands for which they are coming from. And if you're not aware of what First Nation it is that you're zooming in from, that would be your first homework, is to find out. But if you want to put it in the chat or whatever, it would be important for everyone to acknowledge the lands that they are zooming in from. I want to explain the difference between a land acknowledgement and being welcomed to traditional territory. So a land acknowledgement is something that everyone should be doing. It is a simple matter of recognizing your host. In this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, for the most part, there are no treaties. And where there are treaties, none of them have ever been lived up to. So we have never sold our lands. We've never given them away. We've never traded them. We've never given up jurisdiction. We've been here, we've managed, we have had jurisdiction for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So it's appropriate to recognize that you're guests on these lands. So just like if the President of the United States were visiting Canada, it would be appropriate for the President to acknowledge Canada as the host. However, it would not be appropriate for the President to welcome other people to Canada. That would be the role of the Prime Minister. So it's the same for us in these traditional lands. It's appropriate to acknowledge. It's just simply good manners to acknowledge your host. But it's not appropriate for you to welcome others to the traditional lands. For us here in the Okanagan, we're here, we're the Syilx Nation. It's only appropriate for a Syilx person to do that welcoming. Okay, so I hope that that helps in understanding the difference between a land acknowledgement and a welcome. So without further ado, I want to share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us, so you have a better understanding of what it means to be welcomed to our traditional lands. So for us in this part of Turtle Island, we've had others come to these lands in about the last 200 years. In other parts of Turtle Island, that history goes back further, 500 years, 1,000 years, depending on the location. But it's pretty recent here. And it's important to understand that all of these lands are made up of the blood and the bones of our ancestors for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So it's all sacred to us. Our teachings set up our relationship to these lands. We see ourselves as here, but just a moment in time. And so we see ourselves as borrowing these lands from the future, from future generations of not just humans, but all life. And that's a very different concept than newcomers that came with a idea about human ownership of land. Those two ideals are very, very different. And I'm going to try and help explain that with this necklace. So if I own this necklace, I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away. It's mine. I can do what I want. I can toss it aside, or I can take really good care of it. It's up to me. It's mine. I can do what I want. But when I borrow this, everything about that relationship changes. I can't sell it. I can't trade it. I can't give it away. It's not mine to do that with. There's an expectation that I take the very best care that I can, and that when I leave it or return it, that it's at least in the same condition that I found it. And if at all possible, improved. And that definition of improved is at the discretion of the future generations, not what I think might be better right now. So there's a very big difference between those two ideas. And so it's with that understanding of our responsibility to these lands, waters, all life, and future generations that we first welcomed newcomers to the traditional unceded territory of the Sioux people. And it's with that understanding that today I welcome you to the traditional unceded territory of the Sioux people, with the urgent reminder that none of us, including ourselves as Sioux people, are doing the best job that we can to take care of the land.
The native thing, you know, you're in the unceded territory.
Sorry, Pamela, I think you muted yourself.
Sorry, don't know how that happened, didn't touch anything, but so just that reminder, we all need to do a better job for all of our children, all of our grandchildren, and all of our great-grandchildren. We need to get past talking and thinking about it, and we need to actually take action. So, Limlin.
Why Limlin, why has this request discussed in them questions? until Stakat Kulniut. Good morning. My name is Wilfred Barnes. My ancestral name is Kaninamtum. That literally means bumped by sister-in-law. So I'm just going to say a little prayer. Why limlim kulum chutin karnawist? Tali hastis puus kanalate silko quest. Akats kulkultum stamapanas kalkal. Why tali hastikali ayatswit. Why apana? Why tihu kulumitum hula? Why ska ayam?
I must got the wrong.
Why we stim? If it's nakail chikels, skype chikels chak. It is naksil why tihum te yayatstim. To speak kalk to speetlum te yayatstim. Ulabanats latlastisl I pualkun I slatinum papalata. If he stickled it equals isk. Why hastapna white kitchi skate ustali hastikal tamhula equals tiltsal equals tamih kaliayatswit. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to say a few words and a little prayer. You know, the things that we're going to be talking about today is very important to each and every one of us. You know, at this time, the land is changing. It's becoming fall. And my people have already been on the land and they've gathered berries and they've dug some roots and now they're hunting for our winter food of deer, of moose, of elk. You know, we still go on the land and we still do these things because that's the way we have been doing it for thousands of years. So let's enjoy the rain, let's enjoy each other's company, and let's get on with what we're going to do today. Thank you, my relatives.
Thank you very much, Pamela and Grouse. That was such a lovely, lovely opening, and we really appreciate that you could join us today and calling in from the West Bank. We really appreciate that.
Lim Lim, have a good day.
Thank you. So I just want to now actually offer the opportunity to Sterling Bryan to do a little bit of an opening for us as well, and just set us off on the right foot for what we're about to try and achieve in the next day and a half. And I can't see him, but I'm hoping that Sterling has been able to join us.
I am here. Thank you, Terry.
Okay.
So I'd like to start by, thanking Wilfred and Pamela for the introduction and the guidance to us, and acknowledge and thank personally the Coast Salish peoples whose unceded ancestral and traditional territory is where I reside, and express gratitude to the Musqueam Nation, the Squamish Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And I truly value the opportunity to live, work, and play on these traditional lands. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging, you'll see from the backdrops for Terry and colleagues, that we are now part of an organisation called Michael Smith Health Research BC, and it's a delight to now to be part of a new organisation that is a consolidation of the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research and the BC Academic Health Science Network. And boy, am I glad that that this day has arrived, and I no longer have to engage in so many conversations about consolidation, and we can look forward. Just to say that Research Ethics BC remains an integral unit of this new organisation, and I'm delighted by that fact. So in some ways, nothing changes from a Research Ethics BC, including Terry Fleming remaining as the director, and I'm sure that everyone would want to join me in thanking Terry for the exceptional leadership that she provides to Research Ethics BC, and that will continue. So I'm delighted for that. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. I'd like to thank you for committing time to today's symposium, or the symposium over today and tomorrow. Important, I think, that we take the opportunity to reflect on research ethics practice. I'd like to thank everyone for their service to the research ethics community in BC. Obviously, this is a critical piece of ensuring that we conduct the highest quality and most impactful research in the province of British Columbia. And so I'd like to thank everyone for their service to that community and wish everyone an enjoyable and successful symposium over the next couple of days. So that's, I think, all I was going to say, and I'll pass back to you, Terry.
Thank you very much, Sterling. And yeah, I would imagine that you are happy that some of the consolidation activities have concluded and we can just look forward from now on. So that's good. Thanks for joining us. I know you've been very busy. So we have a great lineup for you today of interesting panelists, and I hope everyone has taken the opportunity to review their bios in our website. So if you have not had that opportunity yet, Paula will quickly pop a link into the chat here for our conference website so that you can take a look at their biographies. And before we get started, I would also like to encourage everyone to use the chat function to connect with others during the session. But if you have a question you would like the moderator to ask the speakers, we would like you to use Slido to facilitate the Q&As in this session. If you have a question for the speaker, please go to the link that is being added in the chat as we speak, or you can go to, oh yeah, just use the link because I can't tell you what the code is. And then you can enter your question into Slido. For those of you who have not used it, it's quite interactive. It's a very useful tool because you can see somebody else's question and put a thumbs up on it, and it helps prioritize it. So please make use of Slido for questions for our moderators, or sorry, for our panelists. And now I would just like to turn things over to the moderator. And the moderator today is Anika Patel. And I have known Anika for coming up on 10 years, I think now. And Anika is the Clinical Services Manager of BC Cancer, as well as the Chair of the Clinical Research Ethics Board for Island Health. And you'll see that's a common theme for us today and tomorrow, is that we have asked Research Ethics Board chairs to be the moderators for these sessions. So Anika is going to be the moderator, and we are also going to have the session of panelists, each doing a little bit of a presentation of their own, and then we'll open that up for conversation afterwards. And our panelists include Dr. Corinne Hohl, Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine, Vancouver Coastal Research Institute and UBC, Dr. Srinivas Murthy, Investigator, BC Children's Hospital, Dr. Greg Haljan, Regional Medical Director for Research at Fraser Health, Dr. Adeera Levin, Professor at UBC, Researcher with Providence Healthcare Research Institute, UBC and PHSA, and Brayden Griffiths, a research assistant with Fraser Health, and Tony Lanier, a patient partner who has joined us to help to share his experience as well. So now I am going to just turn it over to Anika and say thank you very much, and I hope we have a wonderful session.
Thank you, Terry, and nice to see all the participants on the call today. That's incredibly exciting. I'd like to just welcome everyone as well. Terry's introduced me, so I'd like to acknowledge with respect the history, customs, and culture of the Lekwungen people, comprised of the Songhees and Esquimalt people on whose traditional land I attend the meeting via Zoom on. I'm just going to say a few words before we get started and hand it over to the panelists. It takes a very large community to create, regulate, participate, evaluate research. I want to take a minute to thank all the key stakeholders in contributing to this essential work that you do for the research community and ultimately the globe. I have profound respect for the immeasurable hours, passion that goes into being part of the research community within the medical field. The countless hours of thinking and processing, creating, dismantling, and rebuilding, climbing over the hurdles, submitting, rewriting, fitting square ideas into round holes or vice versa, reviewing, debating, discussing, all the while striving to produce evidence to guide healthcare decisions and treatments. And I think in a pandemic, I think it's just exceptional, the work that's coming out and the extraordinary measures people are doing to contribute to this new research and evidence. I've often thought that researchers and research teams, including participants, embody the saying, you fall down 7, but you sure get up 8. So I just a nod to everyone with all that perseverance. And I think innovation ultimately lives in the souls of the research community members. So with that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Corinne Hohl, and she'll present our first presentation.
Hi, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank
you.
All right, here we go. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest, and I live, work, and I'm presenting from the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish nations. What really struck a chord with me about what Pamela said at the introduction was actually something that the emergency medicine community experienced and was really very deeply affected by in the June 2021 heat waves. And I'm so grateful to be able to present to this group of individuals so engaged in research, because I think what we don't always have at the forefront of our mind is that need to really leave these lands in an improved condition, and the impact that we have on these lands. I remember being on call the Monday of that very first heat waves, and we were getting patient after patient in horrible conditions. And I don't know if it's common knowledge, but we lost in about 72 hours roughly 570 individuals who died as a result of climate change. And that represents 27% of all people who died from COVID-19. So I know that this will probably focus on COVID-19 patients, but if we can just keep that knowledge at the forefront of this and understand how we can apply lessons learned moving forward, there are other urgent, perhaps even more urgent health concerns that are going to be facing us that we will need to learn from. So I just wanted to thank Pamela for that. I would like to disclose that I received salary support from Health Research BC. I'm very grateful for that. I'm fortunate to not have any financial conflicts of interest. And I was asked to talk a little bit about the lessons that we learned as part of the Southern Network. So who are we and why do we exist? Well, we exist because, you know, spring break was canceled in March of 2020. Because I have kids, I had taken the time off, and we were reading and seeing press releases and through social media some of what at the time was going on in northern Lombardy. That's the region of the world that I'm from, and so I was talking to relatives, and it was frightening. And as an emergency physician on the front lines, we knew very well that that could be our predicament in just weeks to come. We were looking to Washington State. We know that the border is porous because of just the intertwined economies. And so the emergency medicine community realized that we were going to be on the front lines. We were going to be receiving very sick patients. We didn't fully understand disease transmission at that time. We were quite, frankly, also afraid of getting sick ourselves. And we knew that we would have to deal with decision-making right up front. And we knew we would have to do this within the emergency medicine community, of course, combined with colleagues from critical care, with ward-based medicine within the community. And so what was very clear is the emergency medicine community wanted to learn, but it was very clear that without coordination very rapidly of the emergency medicine community, we would end up with just disconnected case series, and everybody would sort of collect their own case series. And it was already becoming clear from the literature being published that we probably did not need more case series on COVID. What we needed was robust, high quality evidence that would be generalizable across Canada, that would allow us to really guide some decision making and inform clinical care. So literally within about a week, we got together through various professional networks and personal networks, and we decided to work together. The overarching aim was, quite frankly, to harmonize data collection and to standardize data collection. So we would create a whole that was much greater than the sum of individual parts, or literally the sum of individual case series, which you can't really use for many different types of analyses. Our year one objectives from a research perspective were really to enable us to make decision-making tools that were evidence-based. We were pretty successful, I think, in getting some good geographic representation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to recruit centers from Northern Canada. That had to do with research infrastructure. It also had to do with where the pandemic was unfolding at that early time, but it's certainly not quite representative, unfortunately, of the Northern Territories. And as this was all unfolding, as we were struggling to learn, how to treat these patients, literally on a daily basis, we were going through simulation. At the same time, what we were trying to do is implement this network. And as you know, you can't really get very far without getting funding. And so my first shout out is really to Sterling, because I remember emailing Sterling saying, here's the idea. And I think within about a day or two, you came back to me and said, I'm going to give you some seed funding to hire somebody to help you. And that was just critical. At the time, PHSA, now Health Research BC, played that really key role. And very quickly after that, I think possibly even before confirmation of that, I had drafted up a research protocol, had a couple of investigators that had agreed to come on. I think at that time we might have been around 10 people. We had people actively recruiting other sites. We put in our first application to the UBC Harmonized Provincial Review Board. And my second shout out goes to you, because we can't do our work without you. And I was absolutely sort of dumbfounded or struck by the speed with which the reviews came back. It was absolutely an enabling factor. What was also an enabling factor was that the UILO, the UBC Industry Liaison Office, actually was able to share with us a membership agreement, a draft membership agreement from a different network that very much was founded on those same principles of open science, collaboration, as opposed to everything being driven by a central coordinating office, really allow participation from all levels. And that was extremely helpful. And then finally, one of our senior investigators, who really played also a mentorship role to me personally, had participated in CanRock, or the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, in both the United States and Canada, and was able to share governance documentation. Those were incredible enablers. And so just again, that huge thank you. I think those of you who I had on speed dial know who you are. A shout out to Pia and Jolene, Holly Longstaff, and a whole bunch of other people who just played such a key role. Stefania, I'm not going to be able to list everybody. So the start was quick and really, I think, enabling. And then we sort of tripped. We tripped on what I'm going to call institutional, and others would probably call organizational reviews, where we had received ethics approval, conditional approval from some sites, full approval from others, with a bunch of provisos, because we didn't have a data management plan on March 27th when we submitted. We didn't have the REDCap database program at that time. So we then entered into this more nebulous world, to me as a researcher, of institutional and operational reviews. And there seemed to be some of them who, would, with every amendment that we would put in, it would be punted back to ethics, and then it would go through these iterations. And every single institution is set up a little bit differently. And what happened at that level was, a bit confusing to me. It seemed to be more focused on the institution and organization as opposed to the patient. And, some institutions, after they sent us written documentation that we could start entering data, then said, oh, no, stop, because a different person had gotten involved or an issue had come up. That had impacts on our hiring and on our budgets. We had a lot of institutions that were quite delayed. And to be honest, some institutions just couldn't join us at that step. I think the other thing that happened early on was a very well-intentioned effort to try and coordinate follow-up. I think there was a concern that the patients with COVID would receive too many phone calls. And that was also very difficult for us. The mode whereby patients would be contacted was not going to work for follow-up if patients already recruited into a network. And we knew from the get-go that it would lead to consent rates that would be very, very poor and not representative. And that mode of recruitment was going to exclude patients who are marginalized because of homelessness, because of substance use issues, because of cultural issues, because of health literacy issues. And so that sort of change in the governance structure and coordination was problematic for us because it led to huge delays in us able to capture data that we thought were going to be exceedingly important and that we already saw as being very important in the early pandemic in terms of race, in terms of ethnic factors, gender identity, socioeconomic status, occupation. And we know that those factors, they actually drove the second wave and the third waves in this province. So again, we had tremendous enablers. And I think that in terms of the institutional operational reviews, what we learned is that across the province, the same legislation is being interpreted in many different ways, and that makes research progress very difficult. Oftentimes institutions or the operational reviews actually conflicted one another. So that was very difficult to navigate, and it had a budgetary and staff impact for us. In terms of that ad hoc governance structure that was trying so hard to be put in place, that I think it reduced patient autonomy. I probably got 15 emails from patients saying, I want to be in, tell me how. And I can share with you that we have now recruited over 150,000 patients into the network. And we have had exactly one patient who said to us, please remove me from your contact list. So I think the risks of this, maybe we just underappreciated the impacts that would have. So I'm going to just leave with these kind of, provocative questions. I framed them in a provocative way, perhaps to stimulate conversation about this. And then what I'll do is I'll let you know that this is why come August 4th, we had already now had funding for 4 months. We should have been able to recruit 10,000 patients. But really what we were left with because of all these delays, we were only recruiting less than 300 patients a week. And our patients were, let me see how I can move it forward. They were really only reflective of the lower mainland. We didn't have any patients from the interior, from Northern Health, from VHA. We had missed our 30-day and 60-day follow-up, and we'd missed collecting what I believe are extremely important variables to understand health research. And it kind of hit home when in November press conference, public TCON, Dr. Henry stated, I just regret, but public health doesn't have the time to collect these variables. And we sort of went, we could have done it had we been enabled to do it. I think this had quite significant impacts actually because the network was founded on open science framework. So we could have shared all our data, and we said that repeatedly to other individuals who were aiming to follow up patients, and we were happy to add in data collection instruments or work with other groups. And I think ultimately from a research perspective, the delays to actually accruing the required sample sizes and producing those publications ended up having quite a profound impact. You saw groups from the UK who were able to get research results out sooner, albeit with some limitations in data quality and also the methods, I do have to say. And so what happened is, as these groups were working on treatment protocols, that evidence that was really less generalizable, I think, to our patients was taken up in these treatment protocols. And so that's actually what drove some of what happened in the acute care sector. And it basically meant that from a timeliness perspective, we were just not as competitive in an international arena. Now, I will tell you that once those humps in that year one were overcome, you can see that now we're recruiting almost 3,000 patients per week. So we're adding a very significant number of records per week. And now a lot of studies have become, doable, and all these publications that really should have come out in the fall of 2020 came out in the spring of 2021. I'll be just quickly tell you about what's happening in year 2. After putting all this effort into setting up the network, we thought we better leverage this to see if we can help out with the vaccine effectiveness evaluations, because right now they're all reliant on administrative data. We don't have racial, ethnic, limited socioeconomic information within those administrative data sets. And so we were hoping to leverage this network that's now set up to assist with that effort. And I'll just briefly let you know that we're very, very grateful to have funding from public funders again to enable that work. You guys were fantastic, and you've already reviewed and you long approved all of our ethics, but I will tell you that we still don't have linked data to vaccine registries yet. And I think what's, makes us kind of scratch our heads is the fact that we know those data are available. Those data have been available for quite some time. Public health partners have been able to publish with data. It's under a public health mandate, so the data are being made available much more selectively, but not to the research groups that can actually assist with that efforts. And to date, we don't have national studies that include vaccination data, to my knowledge. All of that work is being driven by other countries. And so I'm just going to throw out another provocative question. Once we've deemed something to be ethical and there is a need, so I'll just point you, for example, to transplant patients, which make up less than 1% of the Canadian population, I certainly see those patients I admit them to hospital. I look after them in hospital. They are affected by severe COVID, even though they have been vaccinated. These types of populations, it's really difficult to recruit adequate sample sizes from provincial data sets, and we don't have a lot of those data available to us. So do we have an obligation to try and move data access forward once we understand that it's ethical to complete these studies? So I'll stop talking with that. I mean, my main message to you is a message of thanks and gratitude. We would not have been able to create the CEDRA network without you, so thank you. But I will leave with a few provocative questions, perhaps to debate or discuss later. So thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Professor Hohl. I think you raised some incredibly important points, and I do appreciate your questions at the end. I've asked for those questions to be put in Slido so the participants can vote, and then we can talk about once the presenters are complete. So thank you so much. And thank you as a member of the general public for all that hard work that you guys are doing. And as well as I just also highlight the Research Ethics Boards for reviewing the research and being able to do it in a timely fashion. So our next presenter is Dr. Murthy, so I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Corinne. Can everyone see that? Morning, everybody. I'm here to speak. I'm Srinivas Murthy. I'm an investigator at Children's Hospital and a clinical trialist. And first slide is thank you to everybody who's been sort of involved with this clinical trial across the British Columbia Ethics Boards and across this country. I'm going to describe the study and sort of go through a few sort of highlights related to this issue. Disclosures, I do receive salary support from the Innovative Medicines Canada and Health Research Foundation as a chair in pandemic preparedness research. I'm an unpaid advisor to Merck, Fraser, Moderna, and this company called Genova, and I'm a paid contributor at CBC, the network. So COVID, as we all know, has been challenging from an evidence production perspective, and we can talk about vaccine trials separately, but for interventional therapeutic trials, at least for the first year, there was a large number of small studies, many of which did not produce actionable evidence. And so what the world needed was very quick, very high quality, very coordinated, and very large clinical trials to define best treatment strategies. That's hard to do. And that's hard to do both in peacetime and it's hard to do during pandemic time. So our trial, which is funded by CIHR and many other sort of smaller funders across the country, is an inpatient trial of therapeutics for COVID-19. It's in collaboration with the World Organization's Solidarity Trial. And so basically we are running their trial in Canada so that we are coordinated with interventions around the world to produce the fastest and most sort of ambitious way of collecting and producing high quality data. We add medications, we subtract medications as they become increasingly useful or proved to be inefficacious. And it has a common analytic set. So it's a platform trial, meaning that patients randomized in Canada are compared to patients randomized in, say, Iran or India or the Philippines, and the control arms, regardless of which therapies you have available, are compared. Obviously, this leads to complexities from a local ethics board perspective, and we'll talk about a few of those. In Canada, we've been successful because of CIHR funding and our pre-established networks of sites through our sort of critical care trials group networks. We're active in 62 sites. I have buttons there up for some northern sites that we worked very hard with over this past year to try and get them up and running, and we could not. And I think that speaks to separate issues as to research infrastructure across our country and sort of the equitable access to research more broadly and some of the regulatory requirements that our governments put in place for sort of pragmatic clinical trials. We have a companion study, which is an observational study that sort of goes along with this primary interventional study, and we've recruited about 6,000 patients to that. And that's in conjunction also with the World Health Organization and other global collaborators. And that's been more sort of successful at getting operational in northern sites. This is a chart of sort of our timelines. And we've mapped this out across the country, across those 60 hospitals across the country. And so if you start with the first time a site sees a protocol, it's sent to sites, and then working through the REB approval process. And the REBs, I will say, at least this is the first pass back in 2020, when there was a lot of motivation to get things operational, get trials up and running, and so on. That 5-day submission to approval time as a median is absolutely incredible. And I can't even say that like that ever be replicable, really, from a capacity and scale perspective. And so thank you to everybody across the country who has been involved in that process. A median from 1 to 12. That's an IQR, sorry, from 1 to 12, which means that many sites were well below 1. And so they saw the protocol and just approved it, or went through some sort of operational things. The larger challenges were in the later parts of the getting a study up and running. And that contract submission to contract fully executed for data sharing, funding, and drug liability processes, that took about a month, approximately across sites with a huge amount of variability. But the largest problem, and I think this speaks to Corinne's issues earlier, with some operational approvals at local sites, getting pharmacists trained, getting research staff trained, and then site activation with Health Canada. That took approximately 2 months across Canadian sites. Once again, with a large variation across that. There were some sites that were very quick to activate, sites with pre-existing infrastructure and could just roll things out, and some sites which took a lot more time. And so the median overall was about 169 days across those 60 sites, which is good. Like in peacetime, that's incredible for an interventional study that's regulated by Health Canada, that has weird liability issues with drugs being supplied by different providers and so on. But in a pandemic time, that obviously is not what you want. You want something operational ASAP. And then sort of complicating things even further, this is a global study, and I put a picture of harmony, or people singing harmony in the bottom there, because trying to harmonize ethical approvals for a single or at least a consolidated and harmonized protocol across regional, provincial, local boards, national boards, and then international boards, to make sure that at least as much as possible, the elements of the study that would require intense ethical oversight are in place across all of these jurisdictions is a challenge. And so trying to harmonize those approaches is not straightforward, and there really is no easy or straightforward solution. But I want to highlight, say, like how things work in two separate countries. And Corinne highlighted the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is a very separate health system than the Canadian system for a variety of reasons. But say they have a sort of a pre-existing trial infrastructure across their hospitals and primary care clinics. They also have a singular national REB, and MHRA is their regulator, so they're Health Canada. And so when a trial is proposed, they get national REB approval, they get MHRA approval, and then they start randomizing it all 200 hospitals that are participating in their network. And that's a straightforward process that they have sort of rolled out in the past, and particularly during an emergency, it was very easy. And so for their famous recovery trial, their protocol was written on a Tuesday, submitted to regulators on Friday, I believe, and they were randomizing over 100 hospitals by the second Monday. And that's something that Canada can only sort of dream about in terms of how our system is structured. And then when they want to amend that protocol, they would just go through that process again. They think about a drug, they add it to the approval, to the REB application, MHRA quickly approves it, and then they start randomizing everywhere. One active protocol, one informed consent document across the entire country. In Canada, we have a bit more of a few more hurdles to overcome with each sort of amendment. And so once we were up and running, we needed, say, to add a new drug periodically as more drugs became compelling in the global treatment armamentarium. And so we would have a sponsor REB approval, we would have Health Canada approval, then we would need provincial REB approvals, and depending on the province where different infrastructure exists for harmonized review, local REB approvals where changes along the way could be requested, followed by, with each added drug, operational approvals, and then contract amendments because of the interinstitutional issues that inevitably come up with investigator-initiated studies primarily. Given the structure of our health system, that's almost unavoidable. In the UK, they don't have that issue, given the single payer, single implementer type process they have. And so in the end, what we're left with in Canada, we have multiple active protocols based on the timelines of when things are operational and when things are not at different parts of the country. And then dozens of different ICF wordings, a paragraph here, a word there, and so on, depending on what local REBs are interested in. And so that leads to obvious complexities in terms of budgets and staffing and making sure that documents and version control are operational. I want to talk about this consent document creating, because I think we all, from an ethics perspective, review these constantly, and I see many of my fellow ethics board members from Children's on this call, so hello. And so we have a very active patient group. They apologize for not being able to be here and present this here because they were busy today. It's the middle of the day and many of them are working. And so what we do is when we add a drug, we describe the study, we describe the risks and benefits, and what they want is the simplest possible consent form. They want a very sort of just, this is what I'm getting myself into, this is why I could consider it, and these are the possible risks. They want maximum 1 to 2 pages to look at, and they don't really care about any of the other work. This is our patient partner groups. And then we get told we need to include various templated language from various different provinces who have this trial operational. And so Alberta has their template language, BC has theirs, and Ontario has theirs, for example. And Quebec is an entirely separate infrastructure. And so we go back to our patient groups and sort of revise the language accordingly, and it's a circle whereby the consent document gets progressively longer and longer as more paragraphs are added along the way. And in the end, it's left with something that the patients aren't satisfied with, and in the end doesn't really convey the risks and benefits of participating in this particular study. I put the little monster in the bottom there as a sort of an aside because we've tried to add in various ways administrative data linkages to make it easier for research coordinators and research teams to collect sort of long-term follow-up data and linkage data to lots of other things that would be important to define therapeutic interventions. And that incorporates sort of a huge complexity as to what the consent document has to include from both various perspectives, from the administrative data, the ways that it can be linked, and from the patient's perspective. And so this is something to highlight. some quotes that our patient groups have come up with after showing them consent documents. Nobody ever reads this. This is during our multiple consent conversations that we have over the course of this trial. Why is it so long? I'm confused. And this one that frequently comes up, is this so long because it's a legal document? Can't it just say it's the drugs, what the drugs are and the risks, and be over? And we always sort of have to wrestle with that sort of mandatory wording that consent documents seem to have versus what the patient groups in our patient population, at least from sick patients who are admitted to hospital with COVID-19, want to know for participating in this study. Our consent rate, I didn't have it here, is exceptionally high. I think we're in the 70 to 80% of eligible patients being approached who want to participate in an interventional study. And that's an exceptionally high rate for a very high risk, high vulnerable population. But still, it's an ongoing challenge. And so what we've started over the past maybe month or so, embedded within our clinical trial at a few sort of motivated sites across our country, is that we're randomizing within our trial consent documents. And so we're randomizing the standard sort of mandatory standard RCT ICF and an infographic, basically a pamphlet that the patients can have with pictures and lots of sort of big font, very clear language. And then they're subsequently emailed the ICF because many of the ethics boards needed that, all of that language about data sharing and everything else that no one ever reads from the patient's perspective is there and documented. And then our primary outcome is at 3 months, did you understand what you just did? Are you participating in this study? Do you have full knowledge, consent, and informed consent of what you participated in? I will highlight this multi-jurisdictional issue. TCPS is sort of going through this consultation about multi-jurisdictional research specifically, and how it can be updated with sort of a lot of these lessons from the pandemic. I think the time for consultation is over as of now. I think I've submitted multiple comments to this. I did not discuss the regulatory issues or interinstitutional contracts or many of the privacy impacts embedded within doing multi-jurisdictional clinical trials with linkages. And I think there are separate conversations that we can have. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to everyone on this call. Thank you to the ethics boards. And I'm happy to answer questions later. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murthy, for that presentation. And I really do appreciate you highlighting the participants' comments around informed consent and how they participate in, and also the sort of raising of the hand for Canada to participate in such a global trial as well as during a pandemic. So again, your perseverance and your team and everyone participating. I appreciate that very, very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Greg Haljan. So I'll pass over to Greg.
Greg, you're on mute if you're talking to us right now.
All right, can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Perfect, my apologies. We're dealing with a bunch of Fraser Health technical issues.
You're not riding your bike down that beautiful pathway that you're on?
I really wish I was. I really, really do wish I was. So my name is Dr. Greg Haljan, and although I was the regional medical director for research in Fraser Health, I'm now the site medical director for Surrey Memorial Hospital. So there's been a small change in my title. I would like to start by acknowledging that I with a lot of gratitude, I work, I live, I play, I raise my family in the shared territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Katzie, the Semiahmoo, the Kwantlen, the Kwikwetlem, and the Tawasin First Nations. And those unceded territories are, a huge part of my and my family's life, and I'm very grateful for that. I am going to try to share my screen now, if I can. Perfect. And is my screen being shared?
It is, yeah.
Perfect. Again, I apologize for a lot of the technical challenges we're facing. So I was the principal investigator of the B-EPIC study, which was an intervention study for a monoclonal antibody for the treatment of COVID-19. We had a very, very large group of folks who we called the B-EPIC study collaborators. And to start in terms of declarations, we don't have anything to disclose. I received research funding from CIHR and the Michael Smith Foundation. We have a large IC research group. And when we started going down the path of creating a consensus document across the Ministry of Health, PHSA, Vancouver Coastal, and Fraser Health, we created a consensus document describing the urgency of the second wave in December and January last year. And we also made a condition of participation in the development of the study that folks would not have any perceived or absolute conflicts of interest. I received no support from industry, and indeed the folks who discovered and made the drug, Patel and Eli Lilly, had no access or input to the design of the study. They have no pre-publication rights to review it or influence it, and they have no access to the data. The study itself was funded by the Surrey Hospitals Foundation and with support of Fraser Health and the Ministry of Health. And the funding came through a gift by Adeera, the company that discovered the drug, that was negotiated at arm's length by the BC Ministry of Health without any participation of the study investigators. So very, very early on, during the COVID epidemic, the idea of passive immunity was investigated as potentially beneficial for folks who have the viral infection. Obviously, with vaccines, the goal of a vaccine is to stimulate production of, well, at least in part antibodies, as well as, I suppose, T-cell receptor activity against the spike protein of SARS-CoV, what we call active immunity. However, there's this very, very old way of treating viral infections that dates back to the influenza epidemic in 1917 and 18, of using an infusion of antibodies against provided by survivors to try to help folks with a viral infection to give their immune system a head start. And that's what we call passive immunity. In other words, you're not making the antibodies, somebody else did for you. Now, convalescent plasma, the plasma of folks who survived the virus, was tried in COVID-19, but for a number of reasons, it didn't prove terribly effective. Certainly, hospitalized patients who were very late in the infection, it wasn't very helpful, and for a lot of us, that wasn't very surprising. Because really the best time to treat somebody with a viral infection is before they get really sick with it. Because many of the consequences of viruses like COVID-19 that make people really, really sick are not the direct effects of the virus, but rather the inflammation of our body's immune system attempting to overcome it. A new type of immunity, what we term synthetic immunity, is using manufactured antibodies, so not from the blood of survivors. And it comes from candidates who survived the infection, and picking out the strongest and best antibodies was this first medication, bamlanivimab. It achieved Health Canada approval as a possible agent of benefit. There was a great deal of conflict around its interim approval through Health Canada in November of 2020. But with that approval and the purchase by the Canadian government, the next question was, how can we use this agent of interest? And what was clear to a lot of us in the scientific community was that more research was necessary. Although it had an interim approval and there was some early evidence that suggested a benefit, we really needed to investigate how we could both give patients the opportunity of access to the medication, but ensure that we met our ethical duties and did real research and good science to establish if there is indeed a benefit to it. So a number of us very humbly asked ourselves, instead of assuming we could figure this out, instead asked ourselves, who are actually the experts in designing and supporting ethically sound community research studies in antiviral therapeutics during an epidemic? And the answer to that question was pretty obvious. It was the HIV Trials Network, who've been doing this for the better part of 3 decades almost, or possibly. So we talked to them, and they certainly helped us. They certainly helped us very much with our desire to develop a clinical study. The outstanding issue was how you design a clinical study in this environment. And again, we really started out with creating a consensus document of important stakeholders, trying to establish an ethical process by which we could navigate the structures of designing a clinical trial. We recognized very early on that there were also important clinical issues. We really wanted to, if we were to offer patients the opportunity to participate in a trial, capture those patients within 3 days of their diagnosis, to give them the best chance of benefiting from the drug if it was indeed beneficial. And we knew that we couldn't take a typical research study program, which really exists over months or years. We decided to go with an accelerated timeline and to do concurrency, to start writing the protocol, getting stakeholder feedback, and preparing for scientific review at the same time while we engaged in discussions around ethics. And we're very fortunate that the Ministry of Health took on the entire structure around funding. We're very lucky. Fraser Health provided a tremendous amount of support. The Department of Evaluation and Research Sciences were incredibly helpful. Clinical Trials BC helped us reach out to Health Canada, where we asked what phase of study this would be considered in terms of Health Canada regulation, to which the answer we received was a phase 4 based on our proposal. And we started to also develop at the same time the clinical program. We had to devise an entirely new way to have patients find a clinic, be isolated from other sick patients, because we did not want folks with COVID, exposing their infection at the peak of their infectivity to other patients who were sick and needing the hospital. So when you look at operational planning, I mean, we really compressed things a lot, and this created a tremendous amount of distress. And we were already in a very, very difficult political environment, because there was a great deal of distress in the scientific community about Health Canada's early approval of this medication. And in many ways, I think a lot of folks, either in the press and in the community, wanted to relitigate that entire acceptance instead of prioritizing patients. We engaged patient partners who helped us prioritize not just how we were going to respond to important issues. There are obviously substantial ethical issues in terms of calling patients who are afraid with their new diagnosis of COVID. We know that the patients, at highest risk of hospitalization, were certainly very much, elderly, chronic medical conditions, issues with mobility. And we were very limited in our ability to reach out into the community to provide an infusion of an antibody medication in a setting for which there was no actual quality patient care model. With the help of the HIV Trials Network, the phase 4 clinical trial structure, after we looked through these challenges, that seemed the best was one that there is actually a fair bit of experience in British Columbia. It's called a stepped wedge clinical trial. It's a phase 4 study in which you use these challenges in rolling out a new clinical program to collect data prospectively in which the communities that you're just not ready to build that clinical program in yet provide your control group, and the communities where the medication can be made available with the clinical program are your intervention group. And as you roll it out, you slowly add more communities, continuously recruiting until at the end of the study, all communities have access to the medication. And we randomly allocated in Fraser Health which communities we would start with and what the progression of the access to the medication and clinical service would be. It's a form of cluster randomization. And while it's certainly not a standard randomized controlled placebo study, given the strictures we were under during the COVID epidemic, it seemed to be the best way to move forward. And certainly the HIV Trials Network, who are the experts, supported us in developing this model. Other struggles that we faced were processes that allowed patients, within a very restricted timeline to make a decision about participation and ensuring that they had the ability to decline. We knew that patients could actually get very sick from the time of their diagnosis to the time that they would be able to arrive in the clinic the next day. And we did see folks who needed to be admitted to hospital. And we had processes by which patients who arrived in the clinic could be immediately moved to the emergency department for assessment. We had to do a great deal of care remotely and virtually, as I think all of us did. And that remote recruitment and remote discussions with clinical trial patients, it makes us all uncomfortable because it doesn't allow us to develop a relationship in a way that will allow patients to feel supported by their participation in research. And then lastly, we're very much faced with constantly evolving public health guidelines, guidelines around vaccination in the presence or absence of an infection or antibody therapeutics. The evolution of variants created a tremendous amount of challenges for us. The variants were different between Vancouver and Fraser Health, and that created a great deal of conflict because it was very hard for the oversight of our study at administrative level to support us when it was not made clear that our variant issues in Fraser Health were very different from those in Vancouver Coastal Health, given that the medication we're testing, bamlanivimab, did not actually have activity against the P1 variant that caused a significant outbreak in Coastal very early on. So that created a great deal of frustration. And I want to start by saying that the ethics processes that we engage in, folks and privacy, including Holly Longstaff, folks at PHSA and UBC, were incredibly helpful. DERS and Fraser Health, again, incredibly helpful. We flew through the ethics application process and the questions we were asked. It was incredibly helpful. I think that the experience of the folks that came before us had really helped streamline a lot of the concerns that other researchers have discussed. What's more, our patient partners were incredibly helpful. They didn't just inform what we did. They really helped relieve us of a lot of the distress that came with such a rapid concurrent development. I can't describe enough how helpful they were. We were getting feedback because the initial study suggested that, we were testing a reduction in hospitalization and a reduction in emergency department visits were a composite outcome in the early studies. And a lot of folks are saying, well, it's not really beneficial to include emergency department visits and a reduction therein. Whereas our patient partners were very clear to us because they had been in a hospital, they'd come to the emerge, and in Fraser Health, our emerges were overwhelmed with hallway beds. They felt very strongly that a reduction in emergency department visits was actually a very valid outcome to our study, contrary to the feeling of a lot of senior scientists. And then lastly, UBC was really outstanding in their support for helping us coordinate the clinical side, the research side, and making research really part of clinical care and breaking down, I think, a lot of the barriers that exist between clinicians and researchers that create a dead space where many of us who are trying to move forward with important programs find ourselves. Other issues, communication is important. We've learned that in COVID, and that was very true for us. We were not allowed to communicate directly with the press by order of the Ministry of Health because of the political issues around this medication, to the point where we were constantly struggling with misinformation, including family physicians that were advising their patients to withdraw from the study because they felt that the messaging was that the medication wasn't safe and that the patients shouldn't be guinea pigs. We really needed a strong statement of support about research from political leaders, and frankly, we didn't get it. The messaging that the drug was unproven, well, of course, why else would we be doing a study, was very challenging. There was active misinformation in our study about funding roles and responsibilities, a lot of confusion about what is different between a phase 3 and a phase 4 study and who makes that designation. Certainly we reached out to Health Canada, and that was very much a major issue. And Health Canada certainly supported us very early on in our study design. Roles and responsibilities, these were also a lot of confusion, and it got to the point where, and I think a lot of us have experienced this over the last 6 months, the amount of anger that we faced on social media was extraordinary, to the point where I actually deleted my professional social media accounts because of the active trolling. It was a very, very challenging environment to work in. We really went the distance with our patients, and the jurisdictional challenges between health authorities was extreme. It was not a unified process by which we could bridge health authorities, and we really needed a better way to break down those barriers between health authorities and their own individual concerns. At the end of the day, we were very successful. I will be honest. We were told that our study was not possible to complete, either within the timeframes or frankly at all, and that we wouldn't be able to capture patients. Our consent rate was extremely high. We were able to recruit within 80% of our goals prospectively, and we were able to capture 100% of our patients within 3 days of not only recruiting them, but getting them into the clinic within 3 days. I think we had one single protocol violation whereby a patient showed up a mere matter of hours after the 72-hour window. And for that, I think a tremendous amount of work from our research assistants, from DERS, from senior leadership in Fraser Health, from the folks in the ministry and the PHSA that did, really do the lion's share of the work to make this happen. Although there was a breakdown in communication and challenges across jurisdictions, at the end, everybody did really come together and make this research study happen. And right now, we're completing our 6-month follow-ups for health-related quality of life, and basically trying to ask a question nobody else has worldwide, which is whether or not these therapeutics have an effect on long COVID, which we're very hopeful will make this British Columbia-led and inspired study an example of what can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haljan. And I appreciate your multitasking, because it appears that you are extremely busy, and we really appreciate your time. What a fantastic presentation. There were some highlights in there for me, and I'm going to ask a few questions at the end regarding some of the highlights that you've had. I too have participated in something that was told, this will never happen. Island Health will never have a genome large-scale grant. And we were successful years ago. So I appreciate that perseverance. And when you know what's right and you know the path you need to take, it's amazing sometimes the community wraps around you to support you. So I'm pleased to see a successful project. All right, so just doing a time check. So we're a little bit behind, but I think we're okay. We've got plenty of time for the question period. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please pop them in the Slido or even in the chat, and I think someone can put it in Slido if you don't have Slido. There are some questions in Slido coming, and so I appreciate those. So our next presentation has 3 presenters. We've got Dr. Levin, we've got Mr. Griffiths, and Mr. Lanier, and so I'll pass it over to Dr. Levin for the next presentation.
Great, can you see my screen?
Not quite yet, but I'm sure it'll come.
Oh, hold on. No, I know what I did. That. Okay. Oh, there it is.
I can tell you have multiple screens.
I do. There it is. Share.
There you go.
You see that? Yep. Great. So thank you. I too would like to acknowledge with gratitude and humbleness that I live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, and want you all to reflect as our opening folks, Pamela, wanted us to, on where you are and why you're there and how best to appreciate it. My job, along with my co-presenters, is really an interesting come together of all the different things that the previous three speakers spoke about, and we're going to give you not just my perspective as a researcher, administrator, and clinician, but also the perspective of a patient partner, as well as a research assistant, and hopefully that will pull it all together. So we're going to talk about the post-COVID-19 Interdisciplinary Clinical Care Network, fondly called the PCICCN, as a real case study for trying to develop an integrated care and research paradigm so that some of the very problems that you heard about that Greg and Corinne and Srin talked about might not occur. And this is all in the context of people who have survived COVID and actually are living with persistent symptoms. So the concept was that we would coordinate care, research, and education for patients for optimal outcomes using the post-COVID-19 recovery clinics for those people that had persistent symptoms within a larger network where we had both research and education, patient, public, and physician-facing. We have been working hard to provide a province-wide network of clinics that allows this coordinated care, which was both in person and virtually. And the concept was people who were still suffering from COVID needed easy access to multiple specialists, no matter what the organ system or systems were involved, as well as physiotherapy, nutrition, various other things. They also needed easy access to the right tests and not a lot of duplication. At the same time, we appreciated all of the need for coordinated research, be that basic translational, clinical, or implementation science, so we could reduce the burden on this group of people who, as we know, everyone is curious to find out what and how to do it better, but we didn't want them to have duplicating forms, duplicating of various aspects of things and tests. And we want to be able to share all the results between scientists, clinicians, and health policymakers. And ultimately, data from clinical care to inform research, as Corinne actually alluded to, and linking of data to inform long-term needs. So how could you build it in the first instance to be fit for purpose? So the notion here was a real learning health system. How do you learn in real time? So you have a community with at-risk and COVID-positive patients, some of whom are hospitalized and some of whom are not, who may or may not have doctors. And as Corinne already alluded to, some do not. But the notion was we would set up these clinics, these clinical care clinics, on a bedrock of research where there were clinical standardized protocols. We had the same information collected on everybody regularly, but we could also implement interventional trials and get blood for biobanking so that we could actually ask questions after the fact. So these clinics form the basis of this integrated network. But there's a tension that all of you will know between clinical and research interfaces. First of all, we had to set these clinics up over time in 4 different locations in the context of a pandemic, where everyone is, in the emergency room, ICU, and hospitals, and we're trying to say, yeah, but we need to take care of people afterwards. And so how do you do that? And so there was a time lag. There was variable resources and funding available for those clinics. And we actually, from the get-go, said that we needed the research assistants embedded in the clinical care model, a little bit more like the UK model. But learning how to navigate that and defining the role was quite foreign to people. And then there were internal health authority related protocols. You'll see some of the themes keep coming up, and external protocols that we wanted to do as a network. There were lots of delays and frustrations, even in the clinical, never mind the research sphere. So the approval for the ICCN concept by the Ministry of Health was literally within 3 weeks or 3 months. The approval for funding took over 12 months. This is during a pandemic where people are sitting there looking for help. There were time delays in setting up the different clinics in the health authorities. There were, as you well know, multiple sources of patient information, both paper and electronic. It took time to develop the clinical and research database and the interface of the two. The patient flow, we had to build it as we were flying the plane, as you've already heard. And we had amazingly, a lot of funding for research. And whilst the ethics was not the biggest delay, the real issue was the contracts and getting other things set up. The health authorities and the clinicians were very supportive. So were the VPs of research and all the provincial bodies. So were the patients, incredibly excited. And we had patients in our governance structure from the get-go. But as you've heard from the other speakers, there were many different structures that exist within and between the health authorities that we had to navigate. And the ground staff were not empowered to navigate the system at all. The ethics review, while harmonized, wasn't always efficient because of various operational issues that you've heard about. So perhaps it's not right, the ethics, it wasn't harmonized, but the efficiency of the acknowledgement wasn't. And there were a lot of confusion between privacy issues over clinical versus research, and there are different perceptions across the different review processes as what is a privacy issue. So the concept of this learning health system with everybody is involved with, and which would have set us up with a nice platform that both Greg, Srin, and Corinne spoke about, something that was embedded in care so that we didn't have to keep going round and round mulberry bushes. It was the idea, but the reality is that we didn't quite get to where we need to go. That being said, we've seen over 2,000 people in these clinics that are now not only in 4 locations, Surrey, Abbotsford, St. Paul's, and Vancouver General, but also one being created in Island Health and Interior with a virtual portal as well. So we actually have a triage system provincially. So imagine the possibilities of what we could actually accomplish with that kind of an infrastructure with research embedded in care. But to give you a much better understanding of some of the things you've heard, both from my talk as well as from the others, I'm going to pass it over to Tony, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself and his perspective on some of these issues. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Dr. Levin, and thank you, Terry, for having us speak. I'm calling from the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I appreciate being on these lands. My name's Tony Lanier. I'm a patient partner at Legacy for Airway Health for the last 2 years. Legacy was founded to address the prevention of and care for persons living with breathing issues, such as asthma and COPD in British Columbia. I joined Legacy to take part in health research that affects persons with lung issues like myself. In the interim, I've learned about other urgent quality of health issues, such as the Biobank Post-COVID Registry, Smoking and Vaping Initiative, and wildfire smoke, to name a few. Next slide, please. I'll jump right in with the list of concerns. The consent process. It's not timely. This was one of the first hurdles, but it appears to be the highest to jump over and breach. It's taken many months to secure approval. I want to ask, are consent forms standardized? Or the consent forms review process user-friendly? Privacy issues related to the study also concerns me. Does a patient fully understand their privacy rights? Are consent forms clear and easy to understand for most patients? Does privacy assessments take the whole body of work that a researcher is doing in consideration before making a determination? Government structures. Are governance committees trusted to manage research projects under the protocols outlined in their studies? As I understand, the role of the governance committee includes managing the study and controlling who has access based on protocols that include privacy and ethics. It concerns me that governance committees are at times left out or restricted from doing good and useful work. Can technology take a larger role in the management of data to reduce breaches in privacy? I'm concerned that medical research may lean too heavily on stringent requirements and in turn underutilize the expertise of the members of the governance communities. Research that involves patient partners. It concerns me that donated time and effort made by patient partners may be may not be understood by ethics and privacy. What is the best use of time for patient partners? And it's certainly not standing by waiting for months for the approval of a consent form. It concerns me that time spent to gain approval could reduce the level of attention patient partners give to a project. Input from patient partners is useful for clinicians and researchers. Perhaps we, as patient partners, can play an important role understanding and forming new and improved systems regarding ethics and privacy. I'm concerned that patient partners may be undervalued. Next slide, please. We've heard a lot of this today about consent forms. So at the Biobank, we first submitted the consent form for approval in April of 2021 for the development of the post-COVID network. The samples are to be used for research on projects. Individuals who have contracted COVID-19 are asked if they would like to participate in the study. Many persons have opted in. However, these patients cannot be contacted prior to ethics and privacy approval. It's October and there's no approval as of yet. Meanwhile, the pandemic is still at our heels. From a patient perspective, does the ethics board find value in the post-COVID database? I believe so. Is there a way to ramp up the approval processes for time-sensitive health research? I think the post-COVID database is quite time-sensitive. What about the quality of data collected? If patient partners are asked questions about an illness that occurred 6 months ago, will they remember the details? Will post-COVID patients who have expressed interest months earlier simply lose interest? I can see how this research can add value to both prevention and long-term care, but the problem here is time. So some future views that I might have would be simplify the consent form application process. Create a user-friendly process while providing the information required for the ethics boards and privacy assessments to perform their work. Multimedia is a great way to pass information and increase comprehension. And here's how that might look. Create videos in languages. Persons can choose the language and culture that best suits their level of comfort. Some dry but important content can be delivered differently, and the result can increase the patient's understanding of the subject matter. Think of the pre-flight video or on commercial aircrafts. Take the same message and retool it. Templates. I like to see researchers provided with templates that can be presented to ethics and privacy to move the project from an idea to start smoothly. Simplify the process. Ethics and privacy are very important for researchers and clinicians, and I think there's a better way to work together. Okay, next slide. Who are the patient partners? I'm in a group of 15 or so persons who are quite diverse in age, ethnicity, education, past work experience. And that was by design, as they reflect the province. Our group participated in patient-oriented research training courses, which was offered virtually by BC Support Unit because of COVID. Some barriers created because the training was not face-to-face due to COVID. And some persons used devices that were less friendly for online learning, such as smartphones, some tablets, and some are still using flip phones. The ideal user experience for online learning is probably a desktop, but all don't have access to it. Some have unstable broadband connections and lose connectivity that frustrates the user. Understanding the newest technologies can be daunting, and that includes the chat, breakout rooms, polling. These are all useful, but to some persons, it's intimidating. Some less savvy patient partners may opt out or not fully utilize their lived experiences. So whose voices are not being heard? Persons who don't have access to equipment, broadband, technology, or even interest for that. This can change the outcomes of patient-oriented research based on haves and have-nots. Is the whole story being told? Brayden will address this more in his slides. Next slide, please. And I'll have water. Privacy impact. Privacy is a huge concern for everyone. I imagine privacy assessments are quite complicated. What can be done to streamline the processes? I didn't know ethics and privacy assessments were separate entities. Why are privacy and impact assessments and ethics separate? When or how often are these entities reevaluated for efficiencies? Patient partners want to participate, but sadly, delays in contracts and approval can reduce the desire. Next slide, please. Some last thoughts. Simplify, but not water down the process of consent and privacy. Create a role for an agent or broker to communicate to all ethics and privacy groups and minimize the need for researchers making contacts with different groups for the same project. Think of ways to incentivize timeliness. Expedite processes with expected completion dates based on the study. And those are just some of my ideas as a patient partner. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank the event organizers from Research Ethics BC and Dr. Levin for inviting me to speak today. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded and traditional shared territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My name is Brayden, and I will be providing a brief overview of my experiences as a research assistant and how I've seen research pivot during global pandemic. Currently, I facilitate research in a post-COVID recovery clinic where I see COVID-19 patients with long-term symptoms at least 3 months after their initial infection. Previously, I was part of a phase 4 clinical trial called BEPIC, which examined if a monoclonal antibody serum called bamlanivimab could reduce hospitalization in COVID-19 patients. Before the pandemic, I was a research assistant for about 5 years working on various studies and sites in BC. These are the experiences that I'll be drawing upon throughout my presentation. So conducting research within a dynamically changing pandemic has created many opportunities to overcome various operational and logistical challenges. These sometimes unforeseen challenges require researchers to find effective solutions quickly while still adhering to fixed, preset research protocols. For example, keeping up with the rapid changes in publicly available information involved constantly training research staff with current information so that they could accurately answer questions from research participants. Especially early on in the pandemic, I was constantly fielding questions about topics such as contact tracing, isolation periods, and vaccine eligibility. We also saw confusion in patients who read conflicting reports from different news sources. During the research study BEPIC, we have struggled with patients Googling the medication that we are trialing, bamlanivimab, and finding reports online that the FDA had revoked its emergency use authorization in the US. This made it hard to communicate the safety of this medication when their first Google search result was such a negative headline. As the profile of variants of concern changed in different geographical regions, we found it difficult to educate participants on how bamlanivimab was theoretically effective here in BC, while potentially ineffective in other parts of the world. On top of that, we were racing against the vaccine rollout as the number of non-vaccinated eligible participants started to decrease significantly. As the percentage of older adults who were vaccinated increased each week, recruitment became progressively harder, and there was some difficulty reaching our recruitment goals. The response from patient participants to research during the pandemic has been very positive. I've had hundreds of great interactions with participants from the post-COVID recovery clinic who are eager to find a tangible way to help fight back against this pandemic and contribute to the scientific community. In my experience, they understand that research led to the creation of these clinics and that research must continue to further develop our ability to help them and others. Unfortunately, I have also interacted with a few patients where the effects of misinformation are quite evident. It is difficult to build trust with them when they question healthcare methods, intentions, and capabilities. Personally, I just try to provide evidence-based educational materials to them and share some of my own knowledge in hopes that it might change their negative opinion. This can be a fine line to walk as a researcher because you still need to maintain your professionalism and respect an individual's autonomy to make their own decisions about participating in clinical research. In the early days of the pandemic, just before vaccines were distributed, there was a palpable fear that I encountered in many COVID patients. When I was performing clinical trials with bamlanivimab, participants expressed just how thankful they were for researchers checking in with them on a consistent basis. For them, even though we were not actual clinicians, we became a consistent point of contact for healthcare, which turned out to be a large benefit for their mental health. By participating in research, some participants felt they now had a supportive team of individuals who had their best interests at heart. As to be expected, I've also seen many unique challenges and barriers to research that we've had to overcome over the last year and a half. People want to participate in studies, but at times the rigidity of the research process prevents them from participating. Recruiting patients with an infectious disease requires us to account for the safety of all research staff, participating clinicians, and the general public when creating research protocols. While we were offering a potentially life-saving treatment in bamlanivimab, we had to turn away potential participants who were not able to follow our set research protocols. Certain patients could not receive the medication in the short time frame required, while others could not find adequate transportation to and from the clinic. Communicating our safety procedures in a way that all participants could understand became of the utmost importance. This was difficult at times when we regularly encountered a language barrier with different populations in BC. While this pandemic has affected everyone in some way, researchers still have an ethical obligation to consider the unique barriers that exist for certain subpopulations. I relied heavily upon translational services while obtaining informed consent and required many different translated versions of key study documents. Technology in research has been a very useful tool, but as Tony spoke about previously, it has also become a barrier for some participants. It has kept research staff safe by allowing us to conduct research remotely, but it has also prevented participation for those who do not have access to or the ability to use the required technology. The ethics of justice and equity come into consideration when you require a participant to have access to a phone and afford a provider before obtaining informed consent. For me, recruiting patients remotely has been a unique experience because at its core, research recruitment is all about building trust with patient participants. This can be difficult when you are asking a participant to trust an unknown researcher when they aren't feeling well, when they've never actually met this researcher before, and when they are inundated with fraudulent phone calls. Lastly, I want to address how the pandemic has created many great opportunities to embed research within quality patient care and clinical services. BEPIC actually offered an opportunity for patients to receive an experimental but potentially life-saving treatment called bamlanivimab. Receiving a monoclonal antibody treatment was not a publicly available option at the time, so our research acted as a unique opportunity to offer a clinical service to COVID patients. Research studies like this one have demonstrated how important collaboration is between researchers and clinicians. The interprofessional team at the Post-COVID Recovery Clinic has worked together to ensure that research complements the clinical services we provide. This has created great opportunities for research data and clinical data to work together. Not all clinic participants want to participate in research, though, so we've had to communicate a clear understanding of how a patient's information is being used for their care compared to research. The post-COVID recovery clinics have become an excellent example of this. Biobanking has been seamlessly embedded into the clinical services that we offer patients, and it has allowed us to collect research and clinical data at the same time. I've had many patient participants excited about this integration as well. Within a single appointment, they get to see their physician and receive medical assistance while participating in research and feeling that they have given back to the scientific and medical community. As more research opportunities are integrated into these clinics, I'm excited to see what other ways research can be integrated into clinical services for COVID-19 patients.
So thank you, Brayden and Tony. I think your insights, especially on the heels of what Srin and Colleen and Greg all said, were really quite pertinent. And I think that we've all been wanting to integrate care models and care providers and patients, policymakers, researchers, and clinicians. And certainly, I think we're making strides, but I guess the question, and Terry, thank you for allowing us to participate and for planning out this morning so well. But, the real question is, can we actually get there and try and address some of the hurdles and the issues that were raised by everybody? So thank you on behalf of the whole network for letting us present this, and Tony and Brayden for your thoughtful comments. I'll hand it back over to Anika.
Thank you very much. So I'll take a moment just to thank Dr. Corinne Hohl, Dr. Murthy, Dr. Greg Haljan, Dr. Adeera Levin, Brayden Griffiths, and Tony Lanier. These presentations were amazing and they all fit and intertwined. And Brayden, for me, your last discussion really hit some of the key points that I've been thinking about over the last 24 hours about this day. There's an undercurrent of the fundamental principles of justice when I'm listening to the presentations, being essential for deliberating well, determining an appropriate balance between the two primary moral obligations of health research, which include subject protection and the knowledge generation. Throughout the presentations, I think everyone's heard perseverance, collaboration, various community patients, participants, health authorities, academic institutions, government agencies, sponsors, all coming together in an extraordinary time to address the pandemic at different angles. A couple of the themes that I've noticed when listening is that there is a huge gap around governance. And in particular, if we focus just on British Columbia, perhaps it could be time, it's highlighted that a governance structure that's provincial and then maybe even nationally. The words being used are organizational collaborations and contracts, institutional reviews, the government components, so the Ministry of Health, and I think politics all play a role in what we are trying to do. I think, I've been thinking perhaps this is the catalyst to a governance structure provincially. And I'll just, when I was thinking about Health Research BC and what role they could play in doing that, I think when you look at the ethics history, if you go back 60 years, we've had the guidance provided and then the structures we've built. And today I heard successes around the ethics review, research ethics boards hitting the mark, facilitating quick timelines. And so just a shout out to all those ethics boards, members, everyone who participates in those. I think it's a success story today around that. Okay, so I'm going to move along to Slido. We've got 10 questions that have come about. So the first one is, and what I'll do is I'll just open it up to the panelists. And so I'll say out the question and then anyone is welcome to respond if you have thoughts. Can the panel reflect on what is needed to have a single all-in-one approval process for clinical trials across health authorities in BC? Again, this is around governance. And I think from the concept of it doesn't say whether it's ethics or whether it's governance. And so I'm going to lean on governance because I think we've got processes in place for ethics harmonization. There's always room for improvement, but I think in most ways we've hit the mark. I'll open it up for governance.
Can I start? Because I think if we keep like Tony reminded us, as did Srin with his patient groups, if you keep the reason for why we're doing research, it's to actually get the right answer for the patients. And you build a governance structure that allows you to make sure that most patients, no matter where they are, have equitable access to participation in studies, then you'll get the governance structure right. And it won't be about health authorities. It'll be about people who live in the province of British Columbia accessing research. Right? Because right now it seems it's very institutionalized and it doesn't need to be. And I think Tony also made the point about coupling privacy assessment, contracts, and ethics in a much more functional way for certain kinds of studies. And I think those are the sorts of things that we need to sort of go to government about so that it's not just how do we fix ethics, how do we fix contracts? Like that's not working. Those are my thoughts.
Excellent thoughts. I agree with you.
Can I chime
in? Go ahead.
And in that request, I think we cannot forget groups that traditionally don't seek active research participation. One of the reasons we founded CEDRN is because no pregnant women are going to be included in any of the trials. They're excluded: homeless patients, patients with substance use disorders, patients with mental health illness. There are so many of our patients who are not represented that inclusion really needs to be very, very framed very broadly, because otherwise we risk exclusion. And as we know, a lot of our trial results, oftentimes when you interpret them and you apply them to other populations, we sometimes get different results.
And maybe just to add, we need to sort of differentiate between observational cohort studies, which are super low risk but give you lots of information and generate hypotheses, versus interventional trials. And often they can be pari passu, and those, quote, marginalized or other populations may be much more willing, or substitute decision makers more able to say, yeah, like, if you can find out how to take care of people like me better, I'm okay with that. You know, and I think that's actually how we have to ask the question. It's not, can I use all your data for bizarre reasons? It's, can I figure out how to take care of you better and understand the disease better? And that's, I think, a different kind of language, which is what I think Tony was talking about too, right?
There's a beautiful body of literature by an ethicist in Quebec, and they actually recruited members of the general public, hundreds of people from urban and rural areas in Quebec, and they actually asked, pre-pandemic, the very specific question about use of their data for research studies. If we were to get these kinds of emergencies, and the response was very clear, and that's certainly what we've heard from our patients, is people are in favor of their data being used with the appropriate protections of, removal of private information, of course. But in some ways, I think we were very, very cautious, and I think that cost a lot of time. And I think it disenfranchised some of our patients from participating and from getting research results out sooner. That may have helped us, I think, clinically understand how to respond better to the pandemic in British Columbia and across the world.
I want to add, I had written a question down last night around the general public literacy of research, because I think, from my humble little place, it appears though that the general public's awareness of research has increased, that the literacy around everyone's anticipating Health Canada approvals, you didn't generally hear that in coffee shops. So any thoughts on how to maintain that health literacy, the research literacy? Maybe Tony, do you have any thoughts on that?
Certainly during COVID, we had lots of problems with social media, lots and lots of problems. And unfortunately, there's so many people who get their news from those sources. And that's disheartening. How do you reach out to them? First of all, the idea of having these patient partners, so group that I work with, for instance, we're from all different walks of lives, and I don't know what their politics are. And it doesn't even make a difference, because we're really there to help research. And reaching out to those individuals was a little easy in the beginning because it was done before the pandemic. Now, keeping the group cohesive is now much more difficult, because there are people who simply don't have the technology, or they're busy, life happens as well. And so they start doing other things. So we're always recruiting other people coming in, but also within these patient partner studies, and we do that a lot here at Legacy, we will actually have physicians, clinicians actually come in and talk and give facts. And so this way information actually gets taken into that group and hopefully spread out to other populations. So I'm hoping that answers.
Absolutely. So I've got a couple things happening for me, just so you're seeing my eyes move. I think we're going to try to open it up as well. I'm going to continue asking the questions, but if you have a question from the audience, if you can use your hand, I'm going to see if I can do multiple things at the same time. So I'll mention the next question, and then if you would like to jump in or have part of the conversation, just raise your hand and we can unmute you. So I'm going to focus the next question. I'm going to, our institutional reviews serving our patients. So I think the answer is no. I think in a nutshell, it's no. I think that speaks to the governance piece. I think, Dr. Levin, what you had said about let's ask the participants and engage, and it should take care of itself in some ways with a lot of coordination. So I'm going to go on to the next one if it's okay. Are delays in data access ethical? I think it's a fantastic question. So thank you, Dr. Hohl, for raising that. Any thoughts?
You raised it, Corinne, but like, no, I think, again, from the patient's perspective, if there's information that the healthcare system and researchers can access to inform better care, why is it okay to not allow people to use it? Right? If we need to know, for example, how much COVID-19 long haulers are going to have kidney disease in 1 to 3 years, and I can't have access to that data to help make sure I've got enough resources to take care of them, that's not fair, right? Never mind the emergency of what can we, like how many beds do we need in the ICU and how many bays do we need in emerge? Like that's like the very immediate, but even the longer term. So I think that's how it has to be looked at. And it's not, I mean, again, I think someone else said it, but we've got a small province, right? We have 5 million people that live here. Everybody who submits a research application, honestly, we know where they live, let alone their CVs and everything else. Like it's not a massive community. And we're treating everybody as if they're a completely unknown quantity. And my goodness, they might do something wrong with the data. And yet we have so many other checks and balances to make sure they don't, that I think it's kind of this unnecessary concern that then breeds distrust. And Corinne wants to say something.
Oh, no, it's okay. I mean, this is still going on with lack of access to vaccine data and this completely different vaccine data access, even Adeera between your program and my program, right? And so we could have already run some of our clinical decision rule studies with unvaccinated patients or predict who on ED arrival has COVID. By now, we have enough 2021 patients and we're still waiting for data access. I guess the question is, how do we fix that though? I mean, this is far beyond ethics, but it raises the question of data governance. And I think one of the things I've learned is because that data access piece or that timeliness, there seems to be no body that is held accountable to the ethics board, if you so will, the study of ethical go, release your data. And this seems to be we seem to have no recourse. And this is happening across the country. This is not a BC-wide phenomenon. This is, I think there are possibly some legal barriers in some province, but I'm largely being told this is not a legal barrier. So, how do we fix it? The $1 million question. And, do patients, I often think that the power is actually with the public and with patients.
That does raise a really important question. Who actually does speak for patients? Certainly healthcare is a provincial responsibility. And the role, I think we've made a sea change in terms of, patient-centered research, patient partners in the research. And yet, when we talk about accountability and transparency, it seems to be that the primary approach is to protect patients from research. And I think that occurs simply because there doesn't seem to be a voice for patients. That really is the role of the ministry, to be the referee, to be the coordinator, and yet that's just not happening. Patients want to participate in research. There are undoubtedly a small number who are very resistant, but I think what folks want is a governance model that's comprehensible. I think that, a strong statement that research is care and an integral part of medical care. I think it's a very difficult, highly charged conversation to have with the public, but given the sophistication of most people in the public, that's an important role provincially that needs to be undertaken. And we need structures that provide not just transparency and accountability for researchers who absolutely have incentives that really contradict the best the best interest of the patients. But let's also be honest, the ministry and the oversight bodies also have those conflicts. And I think that there needs to be transparency and accountability around timelines, around decisions, and around what our provincial strategy is to support research as part of clinical care, and how, I mean, we've got great structures to ensure the safety and transparency of research, not so much for those folks that are tasked with ensuring those things happen. And again, I want to bring it right back to where I started. Who actually speaks for the patients? And by patients, I don't mean partners, I mean the province.
So Pia's asked, is the data stewards that aren't releasing the data? No, yes, to some extent, but not really. I think it's a broader issue than that. And I think someone else made a comment about, what if patients said they consent to research? Well, I tried to do this at St. Paul's to get on the I agree to care. I know that my data might be used for statistical purposes. That's actually for governmental, that everyone signs because nobody reads it. But the minute you say, I agree that I could be approached for research or I could hear about, then that just creates a whole legal nightmare for the hospital. And ideally, you're right, that's the way it should be done. Patient says true partners, where I agree to hear about studies, I agree to participate in observational studies, I would like to hear about interventional studies, tick which box applies. And to Tony's point, or Srin's point, like an infographic, what does that mean? No one touches you, nobody knows you. I can imagine a nice infographic of what's an observational study, what's an interventional study, high risk, low risk. But we don't do that, right? Yeah.
In my interactions with,
go ahead.
Sorry, and I don't want to speak for patients. Just in my interaction with patients, there are patient engagement committees. Oftentimes, the interest that I've encountered has been just around the privacy piece, to make sure that we've done our due diligence to protect their identity vis-a-vis the analyst, vis-a-vis, the release of data. And it's not really so much exactly understanding the exact purpose of one or other studies or how many studies will be done, because once, in my experience, somebody agrees that their data will only be released in aggregate, that they're not identifiable, and that they contribute to a pool of knowledge, it's often the response is quite different and actually quite enabling. And that, I think, is what can then, and they often get quite excited when you bring back research results. I think it's a very empowering thing to realize that you've actually been part of that process.
So
I just had a random.
Yeah, anecdotally, so we have we have a number of people on dialysis who get their blood drawn 3 times, have access to blood draws 3 times. They were shocked and awed to find out that we weren't using their blood to understand anything. Shocked and awed. But you collect it. Why don't you use it for other stuff? They said. They never mind signing off on a specific study. So I think there's a lot more. I think to the health literacy, Anika, that you spoke about, I think it would be really wonderful if there was a public engagement of, this is what research is, these are the different kinds, this is how we protect your identity, this is how you can contribute to the greater knowledge of caring for British Columbians. I think that might change the landscape a lot.
I was just going to add sort of what you're saying is that, if you think about transplants, and I don't know the current state, so this is old, but when you would renew your license, you would say whether you were a donor or not. Why those mechanisms are all in place. Could we just attach on, you would be willing to your
perfect,
right? To when you renew your license. I mean, there is exclusion pieces to that because only certain people have driver's license, or maybe it's the BC services card. I think there's mechanisms in place that we can, we being the global we and the research community and governance, I think that there is opportunities within our current systems to tag along. I'm going to shift a little bit to consent, because it was funny. I was again reminiscing about some of the other research ethics symposiums in which I've attended, and consent is always on the docket, always. So here's a few thoughts. Consent is one of the core mechanisms in order to, which we've talked about, consent for data collection, consent to participate in the research. The purpose is to ensure that free choice and self-determination of those enrolled in research. The two components, we all know them well. The participant must understand what the participation involves: risk, benefits, procedures, alternatives, all the classics, and then informed consent. And the second is participation is voluntary. I've heard excellent ideas. I've heard and I've seen using media, all kinds of ideas, you know, shrink it down to a 2-page document. But I've had about 10 years of reviewing clinical trial documents. They still remain 10 to 35 pages with a set structure and complexity ever increasing. I put in one of the questions.
Yeah, I can speak to that as well, because I'm not sure that an individual would read a 12-page document of consent. I don't know who would. I know I wouldn't. So at some point, the person just becomes frustrated, and they'll do a click through. You know, it's sure, put me in, but they don't understand what's going on in the study. They don't really know what their role is. And like you said, I think if it's what are the risks and the benefits, and I think that that's really important. If we can focus on that, I'd be able to get through it really quickly to say, okay, yeah, I understand these risks and I'll sign off to those. And these are the benefits. I'm good for that. Let's go. But when there's the other 11 pages, you know, it drops you someplace off. And so the person comes out actually completely confused. They may sign, but I don't think they know what's going on.
So my other thoughts were, have we gone too far? Have we lost the original intent of consent? Some days it feels like it for me.
I was going to actually just add to Tony's thing. I think the other thing that I've heard patients say to me is, it must be really dangerous if you need this many pages. Yeah. And so you're like actually turning them off what could be a super simple study just because of that. And I think, you know, let's be honest, the consent forms are to protect the institution from the patient in case something goes wrong. They are not really to consent the patient. And maybe you need to separate those two things. Do you understand the study? Do you want to be in it? Don't worry, we've got your back. The institution's all worked out with this, but like it's a bit confused.
So my question was, how do researchers, ethics board, participants, general public, how do we influence substantive change in this area?
So I put it in the chat, but I thought this was just the coolest thing. And this was not my idea. This is, credit goes to Colleen McGavin, who's wonderful. She leads our patient engagement group. And she basically took that consent board and said, I can't understand half of this stuff. It's way too long. And she basically had the patient partners tear it apart and put it all in track. And then I think it was Holly Longstaff or perhaps Upia. You guys kind of looked over it to just make sure that we still have the nuts and bolts of what it needed in there. And then REB approved. I mean, I think this is fantastic. And I wonder actually if requesting that a patient review the consent form for readability, understandability, like just accessible language could be something that it would be a barrier for a researcher, but we want patients engaged anyways, right? So if you're going to be asking patients for participation, why not respectfully have them weigh in on how they would like to be consented?
Or maybe the requirement before you put in is this consent form has been reviewed by patient partners and is acceptable to them. And then you have the double check. Like that would make it even more efficient, right?
And I would even say that the patient partner would have to provide that documentation to the REB just to really establish that trust and make sure that that patient partner, but here I don't want to speak for patients. I'm going to mute.
Yeah, our clinical trials network in the ICU across the country has that sort of as a mandatory thing for that consent documents to be reviewed before they go into ethics. And then, as people say in the chat, the ethics boards should have a patient partner review them simultaneously. As everyone says, it needs to be shorter, it needs to be simpler, it needs to be easier to understand. And I think we're trying to get evidence to say that, just that little randomized infographic study. Honestly, I'm not sure. It's good to have that science to say it's useful, but everyone has told us that we need to make it more simpler. And so the science is only going to be partially useful. I think it's more going to be the policy that says that we can change it from the institutions themselves, because as Adeera said, it's largely to protect the institutions rather than to protect the patients.
And also for the other conversation around, equitable access. I mean, different cultures, different languages, these are not culturally safe documents. If you don't speak English, even when you translate it into another thing, but what we fail to remember is many people for whom we're showing these do not read. They're not literate. They're actually audio. And so there's a nice older paper from 2018-19 in New England Journal about video ethics. That's actually a much better way to consent people, because you can see if they understand or not, as opposed to reading. You have a conversation with them, do you understand? And then it's all recorded, and then that's it. Interesting other ways, whether that's in person, Tony, to your points, and you don't need technology, or virtually. Those would be other ways to do it.
Terry, I'm going to tap you. Is this something that's Health Research BC?
I'm making
from
a list.
Provincial? Great.
I'm making a list based on the comments that are coming up today to see what we can take back, because especially for like the Research Ethics Board, there's a lot of Research Ethics Board members here as a part of this symposium, and also the Research Ethics Board administrators. And it's something that maybe we can come back to the Research Ethics Board administrators and as maybe a part of a knowledge exchange after the event is closed, to say what are some of the things that we think we might be able to take action on. So yeah, I'm making notes.
Thank you.
Another thing that just came to mind is there a role, because a lot of researchers struggle to recruit patients from different cultural groups for every specific research study. Is there a role through institutional support or from indirects to have a really knowledgeable sort of translation service that's not just a language translator, but maybe a bit of a cultural translator that could be embedded within that review process? It would almost be a service that would offer, that would be offered to researchers, so that if you submit then, an ethics consent form, that that would then be translated by a trusted source that has been vetted. It's not just the one person that I meet who happens to be part of that cultural group and speaks the language, so that there would also be some standardized language that could be incorporated if needed, and so that the researcher, could just embrace that. It would obviously need to be funded.
There's a lot of comments in the comment section, so I highly recommend filtering through them. I'm juggling a bit too much to read all the comments, so apologies for that. I think consent forms require us to spend some attention on, and all the research ethics boards across however you participate in them. I think it's important. I've heard it loud and clear in many conversations, as well as today. It's very clear that that's a barrier to research, to enabling research. I think we need to revisit the intent of a consent. We need to revisit the liability and where that lies and how we've managed it, passing it off to, in a document to a participant. All right, so I'm going to go to Slido and see what we've got for. There's a lot of themes happening in Slido for me, and so apologies if I haven't read out your question. So I think we've answered the first one, or the one around consent. How can we move research culture to be more participant-centered rather than one of the risk management bureaucracy, and who are we serving? I think Dr. Levin's comment around that about let's have the people speak, go to the general public, including, and I think when you're including patient partners, patients in the dialogue, they play a key role. They're not just a consultant. And so I've read a few papers recently around that, and I think it's the role, they're an equal party at the table, and they actually can change the direction of your research at times, because you might be off, or you just may have a bias. All right, then I've got the note that consent is being discussed at another session, so apologies to those who's presenting then that I went a little bit off there. All right, the next one at the top there. Will there be a movement in BC to reflect an approach similar to the revised common rule consent process in the US. So maybe I'll pass that comment to Terry to take to that next dialogue in one of the other sessions. What factors contribute to data access and delays is the next question. I think we've talked a little bit about that. And it's a little bit outside of the Research Ethics Board's realm. So maybe I'll again pass these questions to Terry to take to other sessions. We've talked about a governance structure that may be helpful. So I put out a call to everyone to think about how we can do that and also talk to Terry from a provincial way. Bear with me as I just read these through. So here's one. I'm going to switch it a little bit. It's around comparing or using sort of the UK and Canada. So UK was brought up in 2 presentations today for me. The question is around consent, comparing the UK and us. But what interested me was more around the approval process and one protocol for a country and things such as that. What role can we play, or how can we help to do something like that? And is that the right way to do it?
I'll jump in and then Srin will say so. Let's go, you go first.
Yeah, I think like can we and then should we are both separate questions. Yeah. The should we is complicated because the context of local needs, say in the north or different communities, always will inevitably emerge. The can we is a separate conversation as well. The UK has a single health system. One payer, everybody has the same data infrastructure. It all goes to the same portal. And so all the data sharing contract, all of the standards are all very cleanly in place. Can we across provinces in Canada? Not with our health system the way it is. Can we within BC? I think so. Without a doubt we can. I think we have, as Adeera said earlier, everyone knows everyone here. We know who the researchers are, we know who the hospitals are, we know where things are. And so I think we can. The should is a separate question. I think that's something we can unpack and requires some thought.
Yeah, I guess everyone's always afraid of what do you lose when you agree to a common, and then I think I'd rather look at what do you gain, and is it worth giving up a little bit of control to allow us to do this? And again, I'll go back to my 5 million. Like, come on, it's like we're smaller than Toronto in terms of number of humans, and we have how many different groups that we have to get sign-ups on and approvals from? I mean, I don't think the people of BC, and I agree with you, Srin, it's different if you're in the north or in rural and remote or an Indigenous community, but we have people that can speak and represent you at the table, so we shouldn't get it wrong, and we shouldn't avoid trying to get it just because it seems like it's another place, but it is a little bit about turf and control, and we need to sort of figure out, to one of Tony's points on the side, like, who are we doing this for? Like, who are we doing this for? Isn't it to get better knowledge and care for patients in a timely manner? Like, isn't that the reason that we're doing this? So
I'll also add the can and should as it reflects a health emergency versus a non-health emergency, and those might be different standards accordingly.
But hopefully aligned, not too different.
Fair, yeah.
Maybe I'll wrap up our conversation. I really do appreciate everyone's time and the presentations and the dialogue. I wasn't able to see any hands up in the participants, so apologies if I didn't see your hand up. And I just want to take a special moment to say thank you so very much for the presenters taking the time to participate. It is incredibly busy time for everyone at this time, as well as all our resilience is low. Our toolkits are getting low as we continue on through the pandemic. So thank you. And I hope in the future to see some of the conversations and ideas in which have been put forward. I think there are some provincial things we can do, and happy to help and contribute to that as well. So I'll pass over to Terry, and thank you again for having me as a moderator.
Thank you, Anika. We do have a few minutes left if there's anybody that does have a burning question that they'd like to pose, and just unmute themselves, or some other comments that they'd like to make around the questions that were put in Slido. We have a few more minutes because my wrap up bit's pretty short, really. But
okay,
Jerry?
sorry, I was trying to be. I'm a
I know,
timekeeper
it's okay.
usually.
I think I heard Laurel there. Laurel, do you have something
Terry,
you'd like to
I
add?
just wanted to comment that we've heard a number of times that the informed consent form is a document that's designed to protect the institution from liability. And I just want to emphasize that that's not true. The institution, the document itself always says that you are not waiving any legal rights, et cetera, when you sign this. The institution has nothing to do with what is in the informed consent form. It's the sponsors and it's the researchers, but it's not the institution. And the Research Ethics Board doesn't look at, it's not a contract. The informed consent form is supposed to be something that informs people about what the project is about, but it's gotten out of hand, obviously. But I don't think it's because of concern for liability. It's concern to make sure that, quote, all the information that's necessary, unquote, goes in, and people have different opinions about what all the information is, like in detailed descriptions of what you're going to have to go through, how long it's going to take, the percentage of risk, the adverse events, et cetera, the whole series of stuff about privacy, so that you know if your data is being transferred, that if it goes to the States, there's issues, et cetera. So it's just ongoing. I totally agree. And I think the concept of having patient partners rip them apart and come up with documents that are comprehensible is awesome. But I really do want to say that that informed consent is not a legal document. It's not designed to protect the institution. It's supposed to inform the patients, but it's doing a ruddy poor job of it.
Thank you, Laurel. And yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Laurel, because when we were talking about the suggestion of having patient partners review the consent forms, this is something that there's a lot of people that have been wanting to do this and get involved in this and make sure that we have patient partners as either part of the research ethics review team or as part of your clinical or part of your research team before the consent form gets developed. But my question was going to be, and what do you do if the clinical trial sponsor sends you the long consent form and sends it to the clinical trial site, and the site says they have to send it to research ethics, and then research ethics says, we really would have liked you to have a patient partner take this apart and make it something that's more usable. Then they go back to the sponsor, and the sponsor says, no, I'm sorry, this is the consent form that's been agreed in however many more states or countries, and this is the standard clinical trial consent document. So I think I didn't mean to start that just in the last few minutes of that little rivalry there part, but it is something that I think we can start to push back on. And I think one of the places that we can do that is to try and take a stand provincially. So there's I've created a list of things here. One of them is going to be starting to talk to Tony, probably Friday afternoon. I'll probably be calling you, Tony, to see if we can work together on something. But I just also wanted to just so there was a lady who had her hand up and I didn't get to her. I'm sorry.
It was Laura. I think
Laura?
she might have put her comment. Yeah, she put her comment in the comment box. So maybe I'll just read it out. In addition to emergency, non-emergency issues, we might want to consider distinctions between research driven by patients, community interests, versus researcher curiosity, career education related to research expectations. And then I'm also going to add the other layer, which is national requests for certain type of research. And there's 3 layers there.
Okay.
And Laura is now our ethicist on the Island Health board.
Oh, hi, Laura. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet all of you. Thanks for including me in this.
Oh, there you are. There you
Hi.
are. Sorry, I read it. Did I capture your question? Okay.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think I agree that comments others have made that why are we doing this? It's supposed to be to help patients or to help the community. And that's yeah, that's why we're doing this. But there's also this kind of crazy research imperative, the publish or perish imperative. And a lot of research gets proposed that isn't actually plausibly all that helpful, but it's a project that somebody needs to do. And I think that needs to be part of our conversation as well, that we need to be not so much the reviewers for content, but if it's just sort of a, here's something that is interesting to look into, I think that's kind of a different circumstance than, the urgency. We're in a situation, we need answers as fast as we can get them, versus here's something that's really a concern for a patient group or a community, and we're trying to respond to that need, or something like a national priority need. Yeah, and then we get a lot of, I do research because I do research, or because my boss or supervisor expects me to do research. That may need extra protection.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where to go with that, but I do think we need to be, context matters. Yeah.
Context matters, and yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to try and wrap this up. I'm going to say, first of all, thank you very much to Anika. You did a fantastic job of moderating this session. Thank you to all of our speakers, because as much as it may look like we were pulling the strings in the background, we brought this group together and they decided what they were going to speak on today. So this was really the speakers that pulled this together, and I'm very, very grateful to everyone for agreeing to participate, because it was really important work for us. And I just wanted to point out as well that I was signaling Anika and saying, move off of consent. We have a whole session on it tomorrow. So tomorrow we have another session this afternoon on genomics research. So if you have not had an opportunity to register, please take an opportunity to do that now if you're still interested. And then we also have one tomorrow on innovative clinical trial design and informed consent. And so some of the topics that we've had today will probably resurface tomorrow, but with some different presenters to start us off. So please take an opportunity to take a look at our website and maybe register for those events. And I wanted to say thank you to the team behind the scenes, because Aoife, Paula, and Hannah, thank you very much for manipulating everything and keeping the magic of Zoom going. Really appreciate that. As I said, our next session is this afternoon. It starts at 2 o'clock, and you're welcome to register right up until that time. And we would like to hear your feedback about this event. We had an organizing committee, and our organizing committee, they're posted on our website, but it was made up of a group of hardy volunteers that really were helpful in making the introductions to bring us together with the speakers from the various events. So I want to say thank you to them. And then also they asked for us to make sure that we always ask in our feedback form that we will offer to everybody by email at the end of the session tomorrow, that we ask for ideas for future topics. And yes, I know informed consent will be on it, but maybe we'll pick a specific element of it to workshop the next time. So anyway, that's my pitch for our feedback, and please take an opportunity to fill that in and let us know how we're doing with these events. And if you require a certificate of attendance for continuing education credits, that also is part of the feedback. In order for us to get you to fill in the feedback form, we offer you the little trick of, and we'll also send you a certificate if you fill it in. So that's coming too tomorrow for you. So please just take an opportunity to take a look at that feedback form tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful to have you all here. And I just want to give an opportunity. Is there anyone else that would like to add final comments before we go? No? Thank you. It's been a wonderful morning. See you this afternoon, some of you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.